The story I'm about to tell you will change the way you see the cute, fluffy animals that wander through your backyard at dusk. This isn't a tale about rabid animals or accidental encounters gone wrong. This is about calculated predation, strategic planning, and a level of intelligence that challenges everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between human and animal worlds. This is the story of how one of nature's most adaptable predators has learned to hunt us in our own homes, and why we're only now beginning to understand just how vulnerable we truly are. On a warm June night in 2010, in the London suburb of Hackney, something unthinkable happened. Twin baby girls, just 9 months old, were sleeping peacefully in their upstairs bedroom while their parents relaxed downstairs. The window was open just a crack to let in the summer breeze. Around midnight, their mother heard sounds that no parent ever wants to hear. Screaming. Not the ordinary cries of babies waking, but screams of pure terror and pain. When she burst into the nursery, she found a scene from a nightmare. A fox. Inside her home. Inside her children's bedroom. Standing over one of her babies with blood on its muzzle. The creature didn't flee immediately when she entered. It stared at her for several seconds, calculating, assessing. Before finally slipping back out the window it had somehow learned to open. Both babies were rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. One had suffered bites to her arm so severe that tendons were visible. The other had facial injuries that would require plastic surgery. The authorities initially called it a freak accident, a one-time occurrence, an aberration in animal behavior that couldn't be explained and likely wouldn't be repeated. But they were catastrophically wrong. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first time such an attack had generated enough media attention to pierce the comfortable bubble of denial that society had wrapped around itself. Because the truth is far more disturbing than a single aberrant animal acting on instinct. The truth is that urban foxes have been systematically adapting their behavior, becoming bolder, more intelligent, and more willing to view humans, particularly vulnerable humans, as prey. By the end of this journey into the hidden world of urban fox predation, you'll understand why attacks like this are increasing in frequency and severity. You'll learn about the documented cases from cities across the world where foxes have entered homes specifically to attack sleeping humans. You'll discover the sophisticated strategies these animals use to study their prey, plan their attacks, and evade capture afterward. And perhaps most unsettling of all, you'll realize that the creature responsible for that attack in Hackney was never caught, never identified, and could have struck again anywhere in the city without anyone being able to stop it. This is the complete story of the fox as predator, not of chickens or rabbits, but of us. And I promise you, it's far more disturbing than you could ever imagine. The red fox, Vulpes vulpes, stands roughly 14 to 20 inches at the shoulder and weighs between 10 and 31 pounds. These aren't impressive statistics. A fox is smaller than most dogs and significantly less powerful than other predators in its ecological niche. But what foxes lack in size, they compensate for with capabilities that border on the supernatural. Their hearing is so acute, they can detect a mouse moving under 2 feet of snow from dozens of yards away. Their sense of smell is estimated to be up to 100 million times more sensitive than humans. They can run at speeds of 30 miles per hour and leap over obstacles more than 6 feet high from a standing position. But the most remarkable thing about foxes isn't their physical capabilities. It's their minds. Scientific studies have demonstrated problem-solving abilities in foxes that rival those of primates. They can learn to open complex latches, remember the locations of hundreds of cached food sources, and adapt their behavior based on previous experiences. Researchers have documented foxes deliberately creating false caches to mislead other predators, taking circuitous routes to important den sites to avoid revealing their locations, and modifying their hunting strategies based on the defenses employed by their prey. This intelligence becomes terrifying when you understand what it means in an urban context. A fox entering a city isn't a dumb animal wandering into unfamiliar territory. It's an apex predator with the cognitive capacity to study, understand, and exploit one of the most complex environments on Earth. They can learn traffic patterns to avoid being hit by cars. They can recognize and remember individual humans based on clothing, behavior, and routine. They can problem solve their way through physical barriers like fences, gates, and even doors. And most critically, they can learn from each other, passing successful strategies through family groups and local populations. The urbanization of foxes began in earnest during the 1930s, but exploded during and after World War II, when bombing raids created rubble-filled spaces, perfect for denning, and reduced human activity allowed fox populations to establish themselves without interference. By the 1980s, studies estimated that London alone hosted more than 10,000 urban foxes, a number that has likely doubled or tripled since then. But these aren't wild foxes that occasionally wander into cities. These are animals that have spent generations adapting specifically to urban life. They're born in cities. They grow up learning city streets instead of forest paths. They view human infrastructure not as obstacles, but as resources to be exploited. And most critically, they've lost the natural fear of humans that keeps their rural cousins at a safe distance. This loss of fear wasn't accidental. It was evolutionary. The foxes that maintained a healthy wariness of humans avoided human-populated areas, limiting their access to the abundant food sources cities provide. The bolder foxes, the ones willing to tolerate proximity to humans, had access to garbage bins overflowing with food, rats and mice that thrived in human waste, and even direct feeding by well-meaning humans. These bold foxes thrived, reproduced successfully, and passed their reduced fear response to their offspring. Over dozens of generations, this selection pressure has created urban fox populations that are behaviorally distinct from rural foxes. Studies comparing urban and rural fox behavior have found that city foxes will approach human observers to within 10 feet or less, while rural foxes typically flee when humans come within 100 feet. Urban foxes are active during daylight hours, wandering through parks and streets while humans go about their business. Rural foxes are almost exclusively nocturnal, avoiding any possibility of human contact. Research on urban fox populations has identified genetic markers associated with reduced stress responses to human presence. The foxes aren't just learning to tolerate humans through individual experience. They're evolving into a subspecies that is fundamentally different from their rural ancestors, one that views humans not as threats to be avoided, but as features of the landscape to be exploited. And that's where our story takes its darkest turn. Because once a predator stops fearing humans and starts viewing them as part of the environment, it's only a small step to viewing them as resources, as prey. The attack on the twin babies in Hackney wasn't the first time a fox had entered a home to attack a human. It was simply the most publicized. When investigators began looking into the incident seriously, they uncovered a pattern of attacks that had been dismissed, minimized, or simply never connected. A 4-week-old baby boy in Dartford had been bitten on the arm while sleeping in 2002. Another infant in Penge was attacked in her crib in 2007. A 5-year-old boy in Eastbourne was bitten while asleep in his bedroom in 2009. Each incident had been treated as an isolated case. No one had connected the dots to realize what was actually happening. Foxes were systematically targeting vulnerable humans in their homes. The pattern becomes even clearer when you look beyond Britain. In Australia, urban fox attacks on humans have been documented since the 1990s. In the United States, attacks have been reported in major cities including Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. Japan has seen a surge in fox attacks in recent years, particularly in Hokkaido. France, Germany, and the Netherlands have all documented cases of foxes attacking humans, predominantly children and elderly individuals. Let me walk you through some of the most disturbing documented cases. In Sydney, Australia, in 2014, a fox entered a ground floor apartment through a sliding door that had been left slightly ajar. The residents were home and awake in another room when the fox navigated through unfamiliar interior space, located the bedroom where a 6-month-old baby was sleeping, and attacked the infant in its crib. What makes this case particularly chilling is that the fox had to move through multiple rooms, navigate around furniture, and locate the specific room where the most vulnerable target was located. This wasn't opportunistic. This was methodical. In Chicago, in 2016, a 78-year-old woman was attacked in her own garden during late afternoon hours. Neighbors who witnessed the attack reported that the fox showed no hesitation or fear, even when they approached yelling and waving their arms. It took several minutes of active intervention before the fox finally released its victim and retreated. The woman required hospitalization for her injuries and developed severe anxiety about being outdoors. In Paris in 2018, a fox was captured on security footage conducting what can only be described as surveillance of a residential building. Over a period of 3 weeks, the fox was recorded visiting the building's exterior nearly every night, testing ground floor windows, examining doors, and watching the building's entrances. On the 23rd night, it successfully entered through an open window, made its way to a first-floor bedroom where a 3-year-old child was sleeping, and attacked. The security footage provided unprecedented documentation of how foxes systematically study potential targets before attempting entry. These aren't isolated aberrations scattered across decades. These are recent events occurring with increasing frequency in cities around the world. And they share disturbing commonalities. The foxes show planning and persistence. They target the most vulnerable available victims. They're not deterred by the presence of humans in nearby spaces, and they demonstrate remarkable ability to navigate complex human environments to reach their intended targets. The response of the foxes when confronted during attacks is equally revealing. In defensive attacks by wild animals, the typical pattern is immediate flight when a larger threat appears. But attacking foxes frequently don't follow this pattern. Witnesses consistently report that foxes pause when discovered, assess the new situation, and only retreat after determining that they're outmatched. Some foxes have advanced toward adults attempting to rescue children, forcing the humans to physically fight off the animals. This isn't fear-based defensive aggression. This is confidence. These foxes genuinely aren't afraid of us. What makes these attacks particularly chilling is that they're predatory. The foxes are entering human spaces, seeking out vulnerable individuals, and attacking them in a manner consistent with how they hunt natural prey. They're targeting the young, the sleeping, and the defenseless. They're attacking with bites to the head, face, and throat, the same killing strikes they use when hunting rabbits and birds. And they're doing it with a level of boldness and planning that suggests they view it as normal hunting behavior. Understanding how a fox hunts requires understanding the mechanics of predation itself. Foxes are cursorial hunters, meaning they rely primarily on speed and agility rather than strength or pack tactics. Their strategy follows a predictable pattern. First, detection using their extraordinary hearing to locate prey. Second, approach using available cover to minimize sound or scent. Third, the pounce, springing high into the air and coming down with their front paws striking the prey's location. Fourth, the killing bite, targeting the neck and skull to sever the spinal cord or crush vital structures. Now consider how this natural hunting sequence translates to urban environments and human prey. Detection becomes easier, not harder. Human homes are filled with sounds and scents that announce the presence and location of occupants. A fox passing near a house can hear the television, conversation, footsteps, and even the distinct sound patterns of breathing that indicate someone is asleep. The approach phase becomes a test of problem solving rather than physical stealth. Urban foxes navigate complex architecture, learning which windows are typically left open, which doors don't latch properly, which pet entrances provide access to homes. They learn by observation and trial. A fox might test dozens of windows across multiple properties over weeks or months, learning which are accessible and which are not. This isn't random behavior. This is systematic reconnaissance. The pounce and kill phases transfer directly from natural prey to human targets. A sleeping infant or child presents virtually the same vulnerability profile as a rabbit sleeping in its warren. They're immobile, unaware, and unable to defend themselves effectively. The fox's natural killing bite to the neck and head translates horrifyingly well to attacks on human faces and throats. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect is what happens after the initial attack. In several cases, including the Hackney incident, the foxes had gripped the babies by their limbs and were actively trying to drag them when parents intervened. Had those parents not responded, within seconds, their children might have been pulled from their cribs and out of the windows, taken to whatever feeding or den site the fox had selected. Let that image settle in your mind. A fox, weighing perhaps 20 pounds, attempting to drag an infant human from its home. This isn't aggression or territorialism. This is predation. This is a fox that has identified a food source, executed a hunt, and begun the process of securing its kill. The question that haunts researchers and terrifies parents is simple. How many foxes have made this behavioral transition from viewing humans as landscape features to viewing them as prey? The honest answer is that we don't know. The documented attacks represent only the cases where the fox was disturbed during the attack or where the victim survived and could report what happened. The epidemiological evidence suggests that fox attacks on humans are dramatically underreported. In London alone, pest control services receive thousands of calls annually about aggressive fox behavior. Hospital records show dozens of fox bites treated each year, though many are reported as dog bites because victims or medical staff don't recognize the distinction. What we're seeing is the tip of a predatory iceberg. To understand how foxes successfully execute attacks, we need to understand the sophisticated reconnaissance that precedes each incident. Urban foxes don't simply wander randomly until they stumble upon opportunities. They establish territories, patrol them systematically, and build detailed mental maps of every resource and opportunity within their range. A typical urban fox territory covers between 50 and 150 acres. Within this territory, the fox knows every accessible building, every regular food source, every hiding spot, and critically, every pattern of human activity. They learn which houses have dogs that bark at night and which are silent. They learn which windows are left open and during which seasons. They learn the schedules of garbage collection, when people typically come and go, and which properties are regularly vacant. This learning isn't passive. Wildlife cameras have captured foxes systematically, checking every window of a house, standing on hind legs to test whether windows will open. Foxes working at pet doors, learning the mechanics of the flaps. Foxes watching homes for extended periods from concealed vantage points, observing the patterns of activity inside. Most remarkably, foxes appear to share information about opportunities within family groups. When a fox discovers a reliable food source or an accessible building, other foxes in the area often begin exploiting the same resource within days. This collective intelligence makes urban fox populations far more dangerous than individual animals. In virtually every documented case of foxes attacking humans in their homes, the attacks occurred during nighttime hours, when humans are least alert and most vulnerable. The attack sequence typically follows a consistent pattern. First, the fox approaches the target building during late-night hours, usually between midnight and 4 a.m. Second, the fox identifies and exploits an entry point. Third, the fox navigates through the building to locate the target. Fourth, the attack itself, delivering bites targeting the head, face, arms, or torso with sufficient force to cause significant tissue damage. This behavioral sequence demonstrates a level of boldness and confidence that is simply incompatible with our cultural image of foxes as timid animals. These urban foxes aren't afraid of us. They've learned that humans, while large, are generally slow, unaware, and remarkably easy to evade once the fox decides to withdraw. The evolution of this boldness represents one of the fastest behavioral adaptations documented in any mammal species. In just 60 to 80 years, roughly 20 to 30 fox generations, urban populations have transformed from animals that fled at human scent to animals that casually walk past humans on city sidewalks, enter occupied buildings, and attack humans in their beds. Now we need to address the question that makes this entire phenomenon so deeply unsettling. How do foxes hide from the massive human presence in cities? How does a predator that's hunting us manage to remain effectively invisible despite living among millions of human observers? The answer lies in a combination of physical adaptations, behavioral strategies, and our own cognitive blindness to threats we don't expect. Foxes are naturally adapted for concealment. Their russet red coat actually provides remarkably effective camouflage in urban environments. The mix of red, brown, black, and white patterns breaks up the fox's outline, making it difficult to spot in shadows, against brick walls, in overgrown vegetation, and among the visual clutter of city streets. But physical camouflage is only part of the story. Foxes are masters of exploiting blind spots, both literal and cognitive. They move through spaces that humans don't typically look at or think about. The gap behind a garden shed, the shadows under a parked car, the overgrown corner of a neglected lot. City environments are filled with interstitial spaces that are technically visible but practically invisible because they're outside normal human awareness. During daylight hours, foxes den in locations that are extraordinarily difficult for humans to access or observe. They excavate dens under garden sheds, beneath abandoned buildings, in storm drainage systems, under railway embankments, and in dense vegetation. These den sites are typically accessed through narrow openings that are invisible from normal vantage points. A fox can live 50 feet from a busy sidewalk without ever being seen by passing humans. This invisibility is enhanced by human psychology. We're simply not primed to look for predators in urban environments. Our brains categorize cities as safe, human-controlled spaces where wild predators don't exist. When we do see a fox, we typically categorize it as a curiosity rather than a threat. The cognitive dissonance between cute, fluffy animal and dangerous predator is so strong that many people who encounter aggressive foxes literally cannot process what they're experiencing. This cognitive blindness means that foxes can exhibit remarkably bold behavior without triggering appropriate human responses. A fox walking down a city street in broad daylight is more likely to be photographed and posted on social media as a charming wildlife encounter than reported as a potential danger. Even when foxes are seen trying windows or doors, many witnesses interpret this as curiosity rather than as the systematic testing behavior that it actually represents. Perhaps most cleverly, foxes have learned to hide in plain sight by exploiting our assumptions about other urban animals. A fox moving through shadows at dusk is typically mistaken for a cat by casual observers. Fox tracks in mud or snow are attributed to dogs. This mimicry isn't deliberate on the fox's part, but it's extraordinarily effective at allowing them to operate without detection. After an attack, foxes demonstrate remarkable ability to evade capture. In the Hackney case, despite intensive efforts by police, animal control, and private pest control services, the attacking fox was never identified or captured. This isn't unusual. In most documented cases of foxes attacking humans, the specific individual responsible is never found. Foxes don't leave the kind of evidence that makes criminal investigations straightforward. They don't have fingerprints. Their DNA can be extracted from saliva left in bite wounds, but this is only useful if you have a suspect animal to compare it against. They don't follow predictable patterns after an attack, often abandoning territories when human pressure increases. This creates a disturbing reality. A fox that successfully attacks a human has a very high probability of escaping any consequences. It's not caught, not removed from the population, free to attack again if the opportunity presents itself. And if the attack was successful from the fox's perspective, then the probability of repeat attacks increases dramatically. We may be inadvertently training foxes to hunt humans through a perverse form of operant conditioning, where successful attacks are reinforced by reward and lack of punishment. Every fox that successfully attacks a human and escapes is a potential teacher for other foxes in its social group. The techniques it used, the entry points it discovered, the vulnerabilities it exploited, these can potentially be passed on to offspring and associates. We may be witnessing the early stages of a behavioral cascade where urban foxes increasingly view humans, particularly vulnerable humans like infants and the elderly, as acceptable prey items. The victims of these attacks share disturbing commonalities. The overwhelming majority are children under 5 years old or elderly individuals over 70. The attacks typically occur during sleep. The bites target vulnerable areas like the face, throat, and hands. These are not defensive bites from a cornered animal. These are predatory attacks from an animal that has identified vulnerable prey and is executing a hunt. Urban foxes are developing into a specialized population that views humans differently from how their rural counterparts do. These aren't just foxes that happen to live in cities. They're foxes that have adapted specifically to exploit the unique resources and opportunities that human environments provide. And for a small but growing percentage of these urban foxes, humans themselves have become one of those exploitable resources. The ecological principle at work here is straightforward. Predators exploit vulnerable prey. If a fox discovers that human infants are accessible, defenseless, and protein-rich, then from the fox's perspective, there's no reason not to hunt them. The fox doesn't understand human society, law, or morality. It understands calories, vulnerability, and opportunity. What drives individual foxes to make this transition from human-tolerant scavenger to human predator? Researchers speculate that early experiences play a role. A fox that successfully steals food from a porch learns that human spaces can be entered safely. A fox that catches and eats a small pet learns that animals associated with humans can be prey. A fox that has a close encounter with a human and discovers that the human doesn't effectively fight back might lose its final inhibitions. This learning process can be surprisingly rapid. Wildlife cameras have captured sequences showing foxes progressing through what appears to be a graduated series of boundary violations. A fox might start by entering a garden to scavenge. This initial trespass meets no resistance. The fox returns, becoming more comfortable with each visit. Soon it's testing doors and windows. It might spend nights exploring the interior of sheds or garages, learning that human-built structures are navigable and not inherently dangerous. The progression continues as the fox becomes bolder. It enters occupied buildings, initially retreating quickly if it encounters humans. But if these encounters result in nothing more than shouting and flailing arms, the fox learns that humans are largely ineffective at close range. We're slow, clumsy, reluctant to make direct physical contact with animals we perceive as cute or wild. Eventually, in some individuals, the transition completes. The fox no longer views humans as threats at all. Personality differences between individual foxes might be the most important factor. Just as individual humans vary in boldness, aggression, and risk tolerance, so do individual foxes. The boldest animals, those with the highest confidence and lowest fear responses, are the ones most likely to enter human buildings and attempt attacks. If these personality traits are even partially heritable, then urban fox populations might be experiencing selection for increasingly bold, aggressive individuals. Researchers have identified what they call superbold individuals that account for a disproportionate percentage of human-wildlife conflicts. In one London study, Just 12% of the tracked fox population accounted for 73% of documented property intrusions and aggressive encounters. These super bold foxes aren't just slightly more confident than average. They're fundamentally different in their perception of risk and reward. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that some foxes attack humans not out of hunger or desperation, but because they can. Predators don't only kill when they're hungry. They kill when opportunities present themselves, because those opportunities might not come again. This surplus killing behavior is well documented in foxes with natural prey. Farmers have long complained about foxes killing entire coops of chickens while only eating one or two. The same psychology might explain attacks on humans. The increasing frequency of these attacks represents a crisis that most urban planners, public health officials, and residents are completely unprepared to address. We've spent decades encouraging people to view urban wildlife as beneficial, teaching children that foxes and other wild animals are to be appreciated and protected rather than feared. But this messaging failed to account for what happens when a capable predator loses its fear of humans and begins viewing us as part of the landscape to be exploited. The cognitive dissonance between foxes are charming urban wildlife and foxes are dangerous predators that attack babies in their cribs is so severe that many people simply cannot reconcile the two concepts. They retreat into denial, insisting that attacks must be aberrations, that the foxes must have been sick or starving. But the evidence doesn't support that narrative. The attacking foxes typically show no signs of disease. They're healthy animals engaging in predatory behavior that is shocking to humans, but completely logical from the fox's perspective. Media coverage has often actively obscured the problem. Attacks are reported as isolated incidents with no broader pattern. Experts rush to reassure the public that foxes pose no real danger, that attacks are extremely rare, that simple precautions like closing windows will prevent any problems. This messaging prioritizes public comfort over public safety. The real costs aren't just financial. They're measured in trauma and injury and fear. The babies attacked in Hackney required surgery and psychological intervention. Their parents suffered severe emotional trauma. Neighbors became afraid to let their children play outside, to sleep with windows open, to live normal lives in their own homes. An entire community's sense of safety and security was shattered by a single incident that revealed threats they had been unaware of. Across cities worldwide, people are dealing with the psychological aftermath of fox attacks. Parents are developing anxiety disorders related to fears about their children's safety. Elderly individuals are becoming isolated because they're afraid to go into their yards where foxes might be present. Children are experiencing nightmares after witnessing or experiencing fox attacks. These are real harms caused by a problem that society has been unwilling to acknowledge or address adequately. So what can be done? At the individual level, the most effective protection is physical security. Windows and doors should be secured, especially at night and in rooms where children or vulnerable individuals sleep. Pet doors should be locked or removed if possible. Yards should be made less attractive to foxes by securing garbage, removing food sources, and eliminating hiding spots. Motion-activated lights can make properties less attractive to foxes, though really habituated animals may learn to ignore these deterrents. At the community level, management strategies need to move beyond the current ineffective approach of responding only after attacks occur. Proactive population management should be on the table, despite controversy. Community education programs need to move beyond "foxes are charming" messaging to provide realistic information about fox behavior, risks, and appropriate precautions. Urban planning and design need to account for fox behavior. New developments should be designed to minimize the hiding spots and den sites that allow high fox densities. Building codes might need to be updated to address fox-resistant construction. Parks and green spaces should be managed to reduce fox habitat rather than providing ideal conditions for fox populations to thrive. At the research level, we desperately need better understanding of the behavioral factors that drive some foxes to attack humans. We need genetic studies to determine whether boldness and aggression are heritable traits being selected for in urban populations. We need better monitoring systems to track fox populations and identify problem individuals before attacks occur. And perhaps most fundamentally, we need a cultural shift in how we think about urban wildlife. The romanticized view of cities as places where humans and wild animals coexist in harmony needs to be tempered with realistic understanding of the conflicts and dangers that such coexistence can create. Wildlife in cities isn't inherently good or bad. It's wild. These animals are following their own imperatives, exploiting opportunities, adapting to environments we've created. Sometimes that adaptation produces outcomes we find charming, and sometimes it produces foxes that hunt our children in their beds. The future of urban human-fox interactions will be determined by choices we make now. We can continue with current approaches, accepting occasional attacks as the price of having wildlife in our cities. Or we can acknowledge that the situation is changing in ways that require new strategies and difficult decisions about how we manage predators in human environments. But here's what we absolutely must understand. The attacks in Hackney and Dartford and all the other documented cases aren't anomalies. They're not freak accidents caused by diseased animals or unique circumstances. They're the logical outcome of evolutionary and behavioral processes that we set in motion when we created cities filled with resources for foxes while implementing policies that protected them from significant consequences. We created the perfect laboratory for natural selection to produce increasingly bold, adaptable foxes. And now we're surprised and horrified when those foxes demonstrate the inevitable endpoint of that selection pressure by viewing us as part of the exploitable landscape. The fox that attacked those babies in 2010 was never caught. It's probably dead now, given the typical fox lifespan of 3 to 4 years in urban environments. But the genes that fox carried, the genes that enabled it to lose fear of humans, to problem solve its way into a house, to identify vulnerable prey and execute an attack, those genes are still out there in London's fox population. They're probably more common now than they were in 2010 because the traits they enable are beneficial from the fox's perspective. And it's not just London. Every major city in the world that hosts urban fox populations is conducting the same evolutionary experiment, applying the same selection pressures, producing the same adaptations. We're creating urban fox populations that are behaviorally distinct from their rural ancestors, increasingly bold, increasingly adaptable, increasingly willing to exploit humans as resources rather than avoiding us as threats. The creature living in the space under your neighbor's shed might be cute. It might be fascinating to watch as it crosses your yard at dusk. Your children might be delighted when they spot it. But you need to understand what you're actually looking at. you're looking at an apex predator that has learned to thrive in one of the most complex environments on Earth. An animal with the intelligence to study your patterns and exploit your vulnerabilities. An animal that, in rare but increasing cases, has demonstrated willingness to enter your home and attack your family. That's the reality we've created. And until we're willing to acknowledge it honestly and respond appropriately, we're going to continue seeing headlines about babies attacked in their cribs, children bitten in their yards, elderly individuals mauled in their gardens. The invisible killer isn't invisible because it's good at hiding, though foxes are remarkably skilled at concealment. It's invisible because we refuse to see it. We've wrapped our perception in comforting narratives about peaceful coexistence with urban wildlife, about foxes as charming neighbors rather than potential threats. And that cognitive blindness, more than any physical camouflage or behavioral adaptation, is what allows foxes to hunt among us, undetected and largely unchallenged. The story I've told you spans millions of years of evolution, decades of urban adaptation, and multiple documented cases of predatory attacks that should have been impossible but weren't. It's a story about how quickly adaptable predators can modify their behavior when selection pressures change. It's a story about the unintended consequences of urbanization and wildlife management policies. It's a story about vulnerability and predation in one of the most unexpected contexts imaginable. But most of all, it's a warning. The partnership between humans and urban wildlife works beautifully for many species. But when that partnership involves capable predators that are losing their fear of us and learning to view us as potential prey, we need to pay attention. We need to take precautions. And we need to be willing to make difficult decisions about management and control before more families experience the horror of discovering that the cute fox in their garden is capable of becoming the nightmare in their nursery. If you found this deep dive into urban fox predation informative and unsettling in equal measure, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who lives in areas with urban fox populations. The information here might literally save lives by raising awareness of a threat that most people don't even know exists. Leave a comment below telling me about your own experiences with urban foxes or your thoughts on how we should be managing these populations. And stay safe out there. The wilderness isn't as far away as you think, and sometimes the predators are the ones watching you from your own backyard.